the New Orleans Saints. How you mamming them? Gotta love a Friday matinee football game, afternoon Christmas delight for those of us on the West Coast. For fantasy, we're looking at some sketchy quarterbacks in this game, elite running backs, a high game total, even though both teams will probably try running the ball as their mode of attack. And so, what does that mean for Justin Jefferson? Are we downgrading Adam Theilen? And with Michael Thomas out, is Manny Sanders a firm wide receiver 3 this week? Also, there's tight ends apparently in this game. So New Orleans, they're heavy favorites in the dome at home. Vikings are getting 7 points right now, which seems like a lot of points for a couple of reasons. The quarterback play is pretty suspect for the Saints right now, and for me, like the Vikings can score, even if it does come during garbage time in this game. Kirk Cousins, like most quarterbacks, he's played far better in a dome throughout his career. Unless we forget, guys, the Saints lost to the Vikings in the wild card round of the playoffs last year. I know, feels like a million years ago, 26-20. So that game actually hit the under, by the way. The Vikings pulled that upset off the back of Dalvin Cook and Adam Theilen, glue guys in their existing core. And since then, Minnesota has added Justin Jefferson to this offense. So, back to present day here. Looking at the total, the Vikings and Saints game has a 50.5 point total. Came down a bit during the week, but Vegas still saying this game has sneaky mini shootout potential. And if you like the over in this game, I think you should like the Vikings to cover as well. So 50.5, that ain't not bad. The Vikings and Saints actually average almost 55 points per game on offense combined. But I don't love the over because the quarterback play for the Saints, like it's up in the air. How healthy is Drew Brees? And the same for the Vikings, but like more how much success will Kirk be able to have against the Saints defense? They've given up the sixth fewest points per game to opposing offenses. Teams barely score 20 points per game against the Saints. And they're coming off a game against the Chiefs. Like the Vikings could feel like a breath of fresh air after Mahomes and co. For both offenses in this game, though, guys, I think the rushing attacks will take center stage with Dalvin Cook facing off against Alvin. Kamara, the running back 1 and 2 overall in fantasy football, head-to-head on Christmas Day. What a present. But with that comes the same question we ask about Minnesota every week, right? Could the Vikings go run heavy? What does that mean for the passing game? So for the Christmas Day Bowl, I'm sure the Vikings will go run heavy as they did in the playoffs against the Saints last year. 31 touches for Dalvin Cook in that game. And if it works, great. But, the Saints are an elite run defense. And my point about the Vikings covering or how the game hits the over, we know Minnesota does have the weapons in this passing game, and the game script could force their hand, right? Like Cousins and company should be put in a position at points in this game where they need to throw the ball. And even if that's not their plan of attack, right? Because they're 7-point underdogs. And with Kirk in a dome, the way the pieces are playing, I think they'll have some success throwing it, even if we have to wait until they're trailing in the fourth quarter to see that. Not sure how confident I am saying the Saints will have much success throwing the ball, though. Like, Drew Brees definitely has the easier matchup here, but the Saints are they're kind of a run-first team as well themselves. Like, the question we ask ourselves about Dalvin in the passing game for the Vikings, that's a conversation we've had multiple times over in the last few years in New Orleans, right? So, most recently, I mean, under Taysom Hill, the resounding answer was yes, this team will go super run heavy. And now with Brees' performance last week, what we got from him in his return, everybody thinks they'll probably go run heavy in this one as well. And in the second half of the game against the Vikings, I hope for them that's true. But I would pose this question: like, if you were the Saints, would you not try and build some momentum in this passing game behind your quarterback, let him get his confidence heading into the playoffs? And if you're saying Drew Brees is hurt, he's not himself, then why are you letting him play New Orleans? I just don't get it. I get that a veteran quarterback, one of the greatest to ever do it in my books. Like, if Drew Brees wants to play, he gon' play. But yeah, man alive, he was just so uncharacteristically super inaccurate in his return last week. Like, he completed just 15 to 34 passes last week. He actually still produced. Like, he put up 234 yards through the air, 3 touchdown passes. And I think this is big, guys. Like, Taysom Hill did not throw a pass in that game against Kansas City last week. Almost like they wanted to get Drew Brees in a rhythm or something. So thinking about Brees in fantasy this week, I hate him. The irony is the rib injury probably builds in an excuse for Drew Brees so far as process from fantasy analysts, because I would love to say Drew Brees at 100% health could dissect this Vikings secondary, but I think that would be disingenuous to say that. Like, if we look at that playoff game last year against the Vikings, Brees went 26 for 33 passing, almost an 80% completion rate, but only 208 yards. Like, that is Dinkin and Duncan at its best. And that style, it just didn't work. Brees turned the ball over. He had an interception, had a fumble lost in that game, in that crucial game, which was ultimately probably the reason they lost. What's absolutely hilarious, I can't not bring this up when I'm looking at this wildcard game, talking about the short passing. None of Drew Brees' 26 completed passes in that game went for more than 20 yards. Taysom Hill had a single pass in that game. It was a 50-yard bomb to Deontay Harris, the longest play for either team in that game. And the longest play for Drew Brees, I alluded to, was 20 yards. That just happened to be a 20-yard touchdown catch by Taysom Hill. So Taysom pretty much had a better game in the wild card against Minnie last year, despite Brees playing quarterback the whole time. So I just can't stomach Drew Brees for fantasy championship week. And, you know, I think I'd start Baker Mayfield over Drew Brees. I think I'd start Mitchell Trubisky playing the Jaguars, believe it or not. I mean, it's not even a great matchup because over the last 4 weeks, the Vikings have actually given up the 9th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks as well. That secondary's improved for sure. I think this week he just ends up in that big fat tier starting around quarterback 15, like guys Tua Tagovailoa, Matt Ryan, Matt Stafford, and Kirk Cousins on the other side of this game. And for fantasy, man, even if I like Drew Brees the most inside of that tier, I still think he has a lower ceiling than a lot of quarterbacks above. You might have noticed all those guys come without rushing upside as well outside of Mitch Trubisky. So I mentioned the other quarterback in this game there, Kirk Cousins. He's an avoid for DFS and championship matchups in seasonal leagues. New Orleans allows the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterback. Signal callers average barely 225 yards passing per game. The Saints are one of the stingiest, defenses in terms of yardage, and even more stingy in terms of touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks. We also saw Cousins had very little success in this matchup in the playoffs last year, 19 for 31 passing, 242 yards, 1 score. So in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, that's under 15 fantasy points. That won't cut it in your fantasy championships. I think I would start Drew Brees over Cousins in this game, but I would also start pretty much all the names I mentioned above. Like Cousins would fall towards the back of that tier for me for fantasy this week. And signal callers like Tua Tagovailoa, Matt Stafford, those are quarterbacks I'm playing over Kirk Cousins this week. And that dynamic that exists in this offense always persists, right? Where we worry about Cousins not getting to 20 completed passes in a game. And I mentioned off the top, the Vikings game plan could be very well to run the ball, right? So turning our attention to the dude who will be doing that, Dalvin Cook. This is a great strength versus strength battle for football for the Saints against Dalvin Cook. Pumped up to see this defense go against Dalvin because the Saints give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs, 2nd fewest rushing yards, 3rd fewest receiving yards. So very tough matchup, but Dalvin is quietly the running back 1 overall in fantasy football right now. Actually, depending on if you look on RotoViz, Fantasy Pros, Fantasy Data, wherever you look, it could be Alvin Kamara as the running back 1 by a hair, by a C hair. My point is, elite dudes bust tough matchups. We see that from Dalvin time and again, including against New Orleans in the playoff game last year. He scored almost 30 fantasy points in that game against them. So they did the opposite of shy away from the run. Like Dalvin had 31 touches in that game. Same with last week against a tough Bears defense as well. So I don't think people should just assume that because of how difficult the matchup is that Minnesota and Kubiak and co won't try and run the ball down their throat. So Dalvin is never anything but a top 5 running back this week. There's only 1 or 2 running backs that were playing over him. One of them, though, is in this game, thinking along the lines especially of like a DraftKings cash lineup. DK is a full PPR format after all. I want Alvin Kamara over Dalvin Cook this week, I think. The matchup is just so much friendlier. Over the last 5 weeks, Minnesota has given up 8th most points per game to running backs. Interesting to note is Minnesota's actually been pretty stingy against running backs in the passing game. They allow under 35 yards receiving to running backs per game. The Vikings have only given up 1 receiving touchdown to a running back all season. Only the Bears have yet to allow a single receiving touchdown to running backs. I don't want to spend too much time on Alvin after I spent so much time on elite Dalvin, but I'm thinking of Alvin Kamara kind of somewhere in between the elite running back he was over the first half of the season and the depth he sunk to a few weeks back. And heading into this game, I care less kind of about the matchup than I do about the volume. Like, hopefully this is the week he sort of just operates as the focal point for the offense for the Saints, and we see an increase in volume for Alvin Kamara. But with that said, I could note that he wasn't super effective last year in the playoffs against the Vikings. 7 carries, 21 yards, 8 catches are nice in PPR, like DK, but he was held to just 34 yards on those 8 catches. So 15 touches isn't great. Efficiency is pretty scary there. Also, last week, Alvin Kamara, well, he did cement his status back in the running back 1 conversation, right? But only 14 touches, did manage almost 100 yards. He did score. But yeah, we want more volume, particularly in the passing game. Like, there's so much we could dive into with the Saints offense in recent weeks, including last week with Drew Brees, but just sticking to Kamara's use in the passing game because I do want to finish him off here. That came out wrong. But something definitely felt wrong last week. The Brees to Kamara connection, it's always been true as fuck. But last week, it was just a bit off. Kamara had 3 catches on 6 targets. So more volume this week. Hopefully the efficiency gets back to the levels we've seen from Kamara that we know he's capable of. He probably just got a tad unlucky, to be honest, last week in fantasy. Like, he could have exploded. Latavius Murray saw 3 targets. He cashed one in for a receiving touchdown. Also, Taysom Hill vultured that rushing touchdown at the goal line last week. By the way, I didn't mention him because he's still just listed as a quarterback, I'm pretty sure, Taysom Hill on all platforms. And with Taysom on the brain, let's actually just roll the wide receiver room really hot for Saints because no Michael Thomas, right? So enter Sandman. Take my hand off to Never, Never Land. And I just got sued. Never, Never Land, that's pretty much where Emmanuel Sanders has been for fantasy purposes most of the year, right? But he's made some big plays in recent weeks, no matter who's at quarterback, too. And Sanders is the go-to guy in the passing game all of a sudden, maybe behind Alvin Kamara. But I think it's safe to say Manny Sandy, he's a legit wide receiver 3 in this matchup. What I have less faith in is saying Sanders comes with a ton of upside with Brees at quarterback, I think. I also wonder if he does get that monopoly in the passing game that we would hope, or that we saw from Michael Thomas. We know Brees likes to spread around, exemplified by last week, Little Jordan something, scoring last week, Humphreys. But Sanders, I think he's a top 36 option this week because the matchup is so juicy. Like, Minnesota gives up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. They give up 175 yards receiving to the wide receiver position per game. Wide receivers have scored 21 times against the Vikings this year. So I mentioned the secondary in Minnesota. It's improved a bit, but a very plus matchup, no doubt. I'll start Sanders over guys like Antonio Brown, over his little cuz, Mr. Hollywood. Give me Manny Sanders over guys like Tyler Lockett, even Robbie Anderson, I think. 100% starting the Vikings guys over Sanders and those guys. Justin Jefferson just won't quit. Good test. The Saints this week is a good test for this dynamic duo, right? Jefferson, he should be matched up with Marshawn Lattimore. Adam Theilen will get a heavy dose of Janoris Jenkins. So you have to wonder if this is a week where they're unable to both live up to that top 15 performances that we've seen in other weeks. And if we have only the ability to have confidence in one of these guys, I think we all have Justin Jefferson ahead of Adam Theilen at this point, even though teams are prioritizing Justin Jefferson over Adam Theilen. I actually think last week's box score kind of sums it up perfectly. Like, Jefferson had 11 targets. Nobody else had more than 5, just 8 JJ had 8 catches, 104 yards receiving against a tough Bears secondary too. And all that just dwarfed Thielen's 2 receptions, 11-yard day. But microcosm time, Adam Theilen had the end zone touchdown last week. And just your friendly reminder, AT does have more touchdowns than Mike Evans, and only Devontae Adams and Tyreek have scored more among all wide receivers this year. So really, I think it's as simple as saying Justin Jefferson is a bona fide wide receiver 1. Start your studs. He falls into that category 100%. And in a tougher matchup, I will relegate Adam Theilen to wide receiver 2 status, but with upside. I mean, he had a big game against these very cornerbacks in the playoffs last year. 7 catches, 129 yards. The next highest Vikings player had 36 yards receiving. That was Dalvin Cook, by the way, against the Saints in the playoffs. But that total monopoly in the wild card is almost more of an argument for Justin Jefferson than it is for Adam Theilen at this stage, because if that were to happen again, if the passing game funneled through just one guy, most of us believe it would be Jefferson in that role. And that's what we saw last week, right? But there's a chance, I mentioned it because you could maybe sit Adam Theilen for Brendan Ayuk because it is fantasy championship week. Definitely a wide receiver 2, though, for Adam Theilen. Speaking of which, a tight end, too. Back end would be what Irv Smith is at this point. Kyle Rudolph was out last week. Irv was coming off the best fantasy game of his career, and Tyler Conklin, of course, produces at tight end for the Minnesota Vikings. We knew he'd be on the field because they run an abundance of 2 tight end sets, but that always has this weird dynamic with Irv Smith because he's best suited to play out of the slot. So he actually is just playing 57% of the snaps since coming back from injury, just 12% of the team's targets. And it isn't like they're just easing Irv back in either. On the season, just over 60% of the snaps. He sits at 11% of the team's targets. Remember, 11% market share in Minnesota is way worse than it is in the majority of other offenses. And looking at the opponent, even if I was on board with Irv Smith as a dude, the Saints have just been menacing and terrifying against tight ends this year. It's funny, like weeks 1 to 5, the Saints actually give out the most fantasy points to the tight end position. Since week 5, they've given up the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. They hadn't allowed a touchdown to a tight end end in 8 straight games before Travis Kelce scored from the 1-yard line last week against them. So Kyle Rudolph's health should be monitored, just because Kyle Rudolph actually scored the only receiving touchdown for the Saints last year against the Vikings in the playoffs. But we're really just avoiding those guys. And, with the land of misfit toys in my head, let's just knock out the rest of these tight ends in this game, because we just aren't looking at any of them. Like, Jared Cook cannot be trusted. Honestly, it looked like rookie tight end Adam Troutman had passed him. There's also Josh Hill, who helps with the run game, so he's going to be in there consistently. Before last week, like, Jared Cook, he was cooking a little bit, but he still just isn't on the field enough, not running enough routes for my liking, under half the snaps in the last few weeks, even though it's a massive uptick from weeks 10 to 12 when he was playing about 1/3 of the snaps. I think for context for fantasy, I would play like every tight end from the Eagles-Cowboys game over these guys. So like Goddard, Schultz, even Zach Ertz. I think Austin Hooper is a good play this week. I've seen him ranked ahead of Jared Cook by some folks. So I'll let you guys go. I really appreciate you joining me. Actually, that's so anticlimactic going on those tight ends. So maybe just to summarize, like, sketchy quarterbacks for fantasy. Mini shootout, probably predicated on like Minnesota having success in this game, right? And if you like the over in this game, you should like Minnesota to cover as well, even though I know they have been shit against the spread this year. But yeah, both teams I think will try and run the ball in this one. Kamara over Cook in PPR. Justin Jefferson, top 10 wide receiver this week. Every week, Adam Theilen, more of a mid wide receiver 2 in this matchup. Emmanuel Sanders, top 30 wide receiver, no doubt. And we're avoiding all the tight ends. So everyone have a great holidays. Make sure you wake up, watch the game, have a blast. I'm just trying to think, like, what should I do here to send off? Maybe I should go through some of the TNFF crew, because they have just been so great. So Connor Donald, make sure you're following him on Twitter. He does everything, runs the account and everything on Twitter. Dan Made Graphics, all this beautiful aesthetics that you see is thanks to Dan Made Graphics at Dan Made Graphics. D. Browner, one of the big beauties in the industry. Jim Nasty at Gold Jackets QBs. All these guys are some of my closest confidants on fantasy football and everything. So make sure you're following all them, all the TNFF guys. Make sure you're following the website at True North FFB. But Josh, Smokey, Hell, Nelson. I got Jules at The Point After FFF, our Lord and Savior, Travis Seal, who always gives the seal of approval at TSeal14. Matt Marche at Matt Sportsnet 590, at Matt SN 590. Joe, editor extraordinaire. The most thankless job on the planet is being an editor. So we thank Joe immensely. Dinostradamus at Dinostradamus is our newest member. Tyler Ellis is our youngest member. Make sure you're following him and give him shit about the Bengals at all times, every time. Brian, my fellow Steelers fan, one of my best buddies on the internet for sure, at the FF Aviator. And Goat District, last but certainly not least, is Will Harris at It's Harris Time, at Goat District on Twitter. So I can't thank all those guys enough. And I just hope everybody has a great holidays and everything. And make sure you slide in the DMs if you have any suggestions or anything you need from the TNFF crew through the holidays.